All right, welcome to Equal Time Soccer. We have a big time guest. Folks are probably very tired of me tweeting about you, Katie. Katie Duong coming in from, she's on the road with her new pro team, DC Power FC, in the new USL Super League. Katie, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I was trying to go back so for those who don't know, have not been following Katie, Equal Time has been covering Katie since like 2019. So you played with the Gophers your first two collegiate seasons. You
Mhm.
were even there. I completely had erased this from my mind. You were there during the crazy like COVID era of the season getting canceled and pushed to the spring. So you were part of that like spring college soccer season.
Mhm. Yep.
Um, Played a few years at Stanford, then went and starred for Minnesota Aurora this last summer, which I'm sure Equal Time fans are very aware of. But now you're not physically in DC right now, but you're playing for DC in the Super League. Your first pro contract, your official pro contract.
Mhm.
What's it been like these first several weeks out with DC?
It's been super exciting. Yeah, obviously, first professional contract, which has been kind of a long-term dream, long-term goal. So
Mm-hmm.
that's been super exciting. Also been super exciting to being a part of something so new.
Uh huh.
The entire league and obviously DC Power being their first year, being a part of it as
Yeah.
well. Um, yeah, it's been interesting. I feel like seeing everything kind of being built from the ground up right now has
Mm-hmm.
been a really cool experience. Obviously, like still working through a lot of things, but I think we have a really good staff, a lot of really good pieces on the field that I'm excited to be a part of.
Yeah. Well, even like so, you go through the Aurora season. We weren't reporting on a lot of this because it's kind of like you know, whatever. But you and several like top performing players on Aurora had tons of random moments of like flying out quick for a Super League tryout. The times where it was visible, we would repost it. Like Mackenzie Rath from Aurora 2 was out in Spokane, and Morgan Stone would sometimes be gone for a day, but then back for a game. You would be gone, and then somehow when I saw you in Chicago, I was like, "Holy shit! How did she get back to Chicago?" So you had all these experiences where even during the spring, I think there was random times where you'd go to a trial or a tryout, excuse me. And so for you, what was that journey like of just having to go through the where can I find a fit? Who's going to actually want to officially offer me? For folks who maybe don't remember, you get drafted in the NWSL draft, but longtime followers of that league in women's soccer know that that doesn't guarantee a contract. It doesn't guarantee a contract offer. And so you still were in this sort of ephemeral space basically all winter and spring. I mean, really up until the summer.
Mhm.
So when did you first sort of have those conversations with DC specifically? And sort of what was it like to finally just be done with that era of your life of like the 6 months plus of like true uncertainty?
Yeah, the conversations with DC actually happened pretty late. It
Mm-hmm.
happened like I want to say like a week or two before their preseason started.
Yeah.
That they wanted to sign me, wanted me to come out and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it felt pretty last minute, like getting
Yeah.
deciding to come from Aurora straight
Uh-huh.
here, which was obviously super exciting in something like I had wanted a Super League opportunity, had
Yeah.
been kind of my goal working through the Aurora season and stuff,
Uh-huh.
either abroad or with Super League. So yeah, I was super excited to get that opportunity and kind of like you touched on,
Mm-hmm.
it was a really long process and it does have a lot of uncertainty and stuff, which I think is something that I'm coming to realize with the lifestyle of being a professional soccer player, which is something that I wasn't necessarily expecting, but
Yeah. Yeah.
has been.
Or even if you're expecting it, you don't know it until you're living it. Like you
Yes.
can't appreciate it until you're living it and your entire life is literally like, "Oh, where am I living now?"
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's like it's a hard balance between trying to stay present and like
Uh,
trusting that like the training you're doing and the games you're playing in are going to pay off, but
right.
then also so much uncertainty of like, okay, I don't exactly know what's next for me and stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, definitely super excited that this worked out and excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, and I know, players of I said from the beginning when the Super League started, the player pool already existed. The
Yeah.
players who were good enough to play in a league like the Super League, they existed before. They just had to go overseas to get those opportunities, or they had to be a training player with the NWSL or whatever. And so I'm sure you had tons of like random overseas opportunities or like random trial type stuff that felt not very firm or whatever. Portland didn't sign you, but I'm sure they would have loved to like have you hanging out training, all these things where like you could have kept playing, but it just wasn't firm, or it didn't feel as real. And for you, what was it about being able to play in the Super League that maybe felt better than, I'm sure you had handfuls of like random overseas chances to go to any of the number of leagues we've covered players in before. What about, being in the Super League felt sort of more firm or more like a better opportunity for you?
I think being in the States is really cool, being a
Yeah.
part of a new league. Yeah, I think at some point I would really like to experience going abroad and just living in a different country. But
Yeah.
I think especially starting out my first time playing pro and stuff, it is nice to have kind of the familiarity of being in the US and like,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously DC is a new city for me,
Yeah.
which has also been a lot of fun to explore. But I think being in the US is really cool. And then I think it's also been really cool to be here in the different types of players that the Super League attracts. Like,
Yeah.
I think a good amount of our team is straight out of college or has had like one or two pro contracts before, but then we also have a lot of veterans who have played either overseas or in the NWSL for a number of years, which is cool to kind of have that mix.
Yeah. I know I think, only my own personal bias of wanting players to be in the Super League is when I try to cover pros who are playing overseas, like I can't always even get like basic stats. I can't get streams. Like it sometimes feels like these players are not being platformed sort of in any way. And so selfishly, like at minimum, the Super League announced that Peacock deal. That's fantastic. All the games will be streamed on Peacock. I know I'll be able to go to these team websites and find rosters and stats and all of this stuff. And so selfishly, as someone who wants to watch you play soccer, I was like, well, this is great. We know we can watch her play. This is going to be good. Because I think we talked a little bit before we started the show. I think people are getting some people are getting overly aggressive with like takes on the league or takes on teams. Like you all had your scrimmage against UNC. And I remember like people were giving really firm takes about like, oh, I can't believe blah, 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 or oh, like how did they play, whatever. And it's like the league is brand new, baby. Like this is like we're not going to know what the league firmly is until, the middle of the season or maybe even the winter break. So it's funny to see people give those takes. I don't know. It's just sort of silliness to me. But yeah. So for you, like you have that scrimmage under your belt, you've been training. What's it been feeling like for you in terms of, even when they talk to you, where did they see you in their system? What kind of role were they talking about? How did you feel like you would fit into the group soccer wise?
Yeah, soccer wise has been good so far. I would say coming in, they said they expected to see me in the midfield, which I feel like was pretty expected. That's kind of what I've played my entire life.
Yeah.
And so far I've been playing a couple different roles in the midfield. We've been moving a couple pieces around just as a team and stuff. And I really, really like our coaches and the way they want to play, and I think it's going to be a really exciting system. Obviously getting that first scrimmage under our belt too didn't necessarily go the way we wanted it to go. But I think I have a lot of mixed feelings coming from that scrimmage. Like there obviously is that frustration and that competitiveness piece of like this is not where we want to be, but I think there also is that piece of me that is like, okay, I know we have the quality of players that we need. It's more so about just finding that chemistry and like getting those pieces sorted out that weren't the way we wanted them to be So I think we're not, yeah, I think that isn't necessarily a
Uh-huh.
representation of what this team is going to be going forward, as you touched on before.
Yeah. I mean, I think like my take on that, like, you go in and like lose to a UNC or the Carolina Ascent drew against South Carolina.
Yeah.
And I think if people on paper are taking games like that and saying like a pro team should beat a college team, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
that's a sort of two-dimensional way to process what I think is a three-dimensional situation. And so,
Mhm.
like, for example, like I was messaging with a parent uh who was like messaging me about that UNC scrimmage that you all had, and I was like, I would sort of assume there's a decent chance that DC would lose to UNC only because like having a system, knowing a system, having played in a system alone is like a gigantic advantage compared to a brand new team that's like building a system and learning a system. And then you have to add in the fact that like there's 5 to 10 players on UNC minimum who are literally the caliber of player who could be in the Super League. So it's kind of like, like Maddie Deline for Equal Time
Yeah.
followers is on UNC. She's a Minnesotan who has played with the youth national team setups, has some chance to go play in the U20 World Cup, which like is the caliber you have played before. And it's like these are very, very good soccer players. Like, it's not like you scrimmage some random run of the mill college team. Like
Yeah.
half or more of that roster are future pros. Like this is a very good soccer team, and so it's just the kind of thing where I'm like, it's an exhibition game. The team is good. DC is new. Like it's hard for me to get like really high temperature about a game like that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, like you touched on, there's a lot of things that play into it. Obviously, UNC's a quality side, so
Yeah.
full respect to them as well. Um, but yeah, I think we're playing a system that's very new for a lot of us and
Yeah.
something that I personally haven't played in before, and I think a
Yeah.
lot of people haven't played in before. And yeah, even from the past few weeks at practice to now, I feel like we've grown a lot in that
Uh
and
huh.
clearly still working out some pieces from that. But I think
Yeah.
the scrimmage was a really good learning opportunity for us. A lot of things did get exposed in that,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
think it's better that it got exposed right now. We can go back and look at it
For sure.
before we enter real USL Super League games.
For sure. Yeah, and it's like, stuff can you train against yourselves, train against yourselves, train against yourselves until you're able to put something on tape against another team. Like it's not going to feel real. You can think it's real, but
Yes.
like even a coach saying we have to defend set pieces this way or we'll get exposed until you actually do get exposed, then a player has to be like, oh yeah, shit, we really do need to guard in that way. Or
Yes.
there's a million examples of that of like, hey, we can't play out of the back this way at this time, or hey, we have to play when we get into the wide spaces, blah blah blah. It's like, yeah, you can intellectually know it, and then by the time you lose a game, it's like, oh shit, yeah, we really have to lock in. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
well,
exactly. Yeah.
well, and so let's talk a little bit about your Aurora experience. It's the least humble, most obnoxious part of my personality has been over and over again saying that I was the one that pitched Aurora on going after you. And it is annoying to everybody, and yet I still brought it up again because I just have way too big of an ego about it, apparently. But you always, like players of your caliber, always felt like someone Aurora in this phase of their team are sort of built for. Like by the time you were at Stanford, you were, I can say it like clearly underappreciated in the sense that, you should have been an early Super League target. You're the type of player if they knew your capacity, they should have went and got you in the spring and poached you. But you weren't getting those opportunities, and so Aurora is a great place to go and just have a shitload of visibility, score a bunch of bangers like you do, and then just sort of get platformed again. But I remember chatting with you during the season, and even the reason I thought you would like Aurora was also just to like have fun playing soccer again, like come and have fun. I'm
Yeah.
curious, what was the actual experience for you? Like I can say all of that stuff and that can be like hypothetical and theoretical, but what was the experience coming and playing in the W League and sort of getting that like that visible platform and but even just being part of a squad like Aurora?
Yeah, it was a great experience and definitely exceeded my expectations. Playing in TCO in front of that fan base and just getting consistent minutes, I think was great. Like, yeah, you touched on it, but just getting in a rhythm of playing consistent games and being able to feel that joy and that kind of just that flow, honestly, of playing in games was huge for me. I think it was really big in terms of feeling like I'm getting my confidence and like getting my rhythm and helping me feel really prepared for this next step. So it was really big in terms of that. And then I would say it was also just a lot of fun, and I'm really grateful for like all of the teammates, all of the coaches, and like all of the fans that I met while I was over there. The way that Aurora runs it was just, it was very professional. It was, yeah, I don't really know how to describe it, but it was all just like really good people who I feel like were involved, like part of the organization, supporting the organization. So I was really glad that I got to be a part of that.
Yeah. By the time the season got rolling, you know, you started just absolutely shredding it, which is, you know, to be expected. But the way these summer leagues work, like, it does take a little bit to like get into a vibe and get into a rhythm. And I remember, you know, when I was standing like field side before an early game, like third game, fourth game, whatever it was, I remember specifically telling you, I was like, hey dude, rip from distance, baby. And granted, I said it to Addie, I would say it to everyone kind of half jokingly, but I also was like, dude, start taking them, like start taking chances. How have you like always balanced that element of, because there's times where I like half jokingly refer to you as almost like too good of a teammate, or like, you know, too nice of a teammate, but then like you have to take those opportunities because you are capable of scoring from there. How have you like balanced that element of your game like over the course of your career of like, well, I want to be a good passer and a good assister and a good defender and a good teammate, but also sometimes I need to like shoot the damn ball and be the scorer?
Yeah, it's definitely a hard balance. I feel like, especially in the moment of the game where it's like it's such a fast decision that you're making. I think something that's really helped with that is going back and watching film for me. Of like it is such a fast decision in the moment of play. So I feel like a lot of times going back and watching film and recognizing, okay, this is a moment that I should have taken a shot, or this is a moment that I should have driven in further, or this is a moment I should have passed the ball instead of taking it, I think has been really big in the development of being able to make the better decisions within a game. So I would say watching film and then visualization are kind of the two things that have helped me most try to improve that aspect of my game. But I think that's always kind of an ongoing process and something that kind of like goes up and down sometimes.
Yeah. Well, like me as a fan wants you to be like 10% more selfish. Like, you know, I'm like, oh man, she's such a like chill person and so nice and so hardworking. And part of my brain is like, man, I want her to be like 15% more selfish. I want her to take like 2 more shots from distance a game. Because I remember when you got actually signed with Aurora for the summer, I remember one thing I said to people, one way I phrased it was, you're such a good shooter and such a good finisher that your misses are bangers. Like like a lot of the highlight, when I went back and looked at tweets that I'd covered your games with the U20s or the Gophers or whatever, like some of your misses were like some of the most impressive like shots that I'd seen, where it's like, you know, off the upper 90 bar or whatever. And it obviously comes from you just like training the absolute shit out of your shot. Like obviously, you know, you're someone that is literally aiming for that top pocket because you know it's not savable. But that really only comes from you clearly just train the hell out of those shots, like individual training, like time after time after time. Was like that finishing training, is that something that you sort of always had parts of and then just fine tuned? Or is that something you felt like you just needed to add, so you added it, if that makes sense?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say I've worked on finishing from a pretty young age. I've been lucky to work with a lot of really good coaches growing up that have had a huge impact on me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that I've always worked on growing up. I would say over the past few years, I've definitely tried to refine it even more.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I read actually this book called The Inner Game of Tennis,
Uh-huh.
which has had a really big impact on, I would say finishing is actually one of the biggest things that's had a big impact on.
Uh-huh.
It's basically about controlled focus is like
Uh-huh.
the main thing of the book, and it talks a lot about like it had this training technique of like you just really focus on one spot you're trying to hit, or
Yeah.
like getting your attention on the right thing. And I think that's had
Yeah.
a really big impact on finishing and like making it more deliberate,
Right.
um, both in training and then hopefully translating to game as well for me.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's I love that like tennis was the focus of it, because that's tennis being like an individual sport. It's so funny because people think of soccer obviously is a team sport, but you did so much individual training, and like so many elements of the game are about building individual skill that like it actually does make sense to compare it to an individual sport, but I don't hear people talk about that much. That's super interesting. Well,
Yeah.
and there was a point, the other like really funny moment I had in the summer was like I was in Blackheart because I think it was an Aurora away game or something, or maybe I was just in there. And someone just cold asked me, they were like, "Hey, is Katie Duong left-footed?" Because you had scored like 4 rips in a row with your left. And I was like, no. She's just very good with her left. But even stuff like that, I'm sure, comes from that individual training environment, right? Like the idea of
Yeah.
all the time you're training with the teams, all the time you're practicing. I think people probably underappreciate the amount of time players like you probably spend like by yourself or in small groups, just individually drilling that stuff, like building up your left so it's as lethal as your right. But I mean, even all that individual training, has it ever been hard for you to like self motivate, or because your goals are what they are, is it sort of ingrained with like, well, no, I want to be a pro player, I know to be my best I have to train X hours a day or week or whatever? Or have you ever actually had like a regular human being trouble motivating yourself to do that individual extra work?
Um, I think there's definitely days where it's like, okay, I'm not feeling great. Like I don't feel like
Yeah.
doing this. But I think my dad has had a huge influence on me growing up of like,
Uh-huh.
okay, if you want to achieve something, you need to work hard for it.
Uh-huh.
I think that's something that was really instilled in me from a young age. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that has helped me throughout growing up and at this point in my life of like, okay, I know what my goals are and this is the work that I need to put in to be able to accomplish those. So I think that is what kind of keeps me going even on those days that I don't necessarily feel like doing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say most days I do genuinely really enjoy doing that extra work. And I
Yeah.
think I've always felt like that's been one of my biggest advantages in part of who I am as a player of doing that extra work. And
Yeah.
I think that's what helps me feel sharp. That's what helps me feel confident.
Totally.
So yeah, most of the time I really do enjoy it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it is. I love the way you phrased it. Like it makes you feel confident,
Mhm.
because I don't relate to any of the amount of work you put in to play soccer, but the idea of being able to operate from confidence is like a huge part of like how I feel most like
Yeah.
successful too, of like doing all the research, doing the prep so that you're operating from confidence. Even like the way, honestly, even the way I cover stuff for Equal Time, like I do all the prep for broadcasting a game, because if I was calling a game and I wasn't confident in what I was saying, I would feel like so scared. Like if you don't actually know what you're talking about, I would feel like such a fraud and feel so anxious. But when you're confident, it can actually be fun because you can actually go out and like do the thing you want to do. And I don't want to blow past the Hugh shout out to Hugh, Katie's dad. The first time I ever interacted with Hugh, I had no idea he had any connection to you. He had probably started following Equal Time because you were getting recruited by the Gophers. and he cold messaged me and asked if I'd ever read the book by Gwendolyn Oxenham, Under the Lights and in the Dark. And it's an unbelievable book about women's soccer, and basically it's super super well done. It's crazy good. You literally should people should literally go buy it still. Like, it's so good. Each chapter was just a feature on an individual person, and the first chapter is about Danny Foxhoven Young, and you read it, and she was playing on this team in Russia. It's unreal, unreal. And so that's actually how I first met Danny, is then because she
Okay.
was one of your youth soccer coaches, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And and equal time people will know Danny because we've had her on 1 million times, because she's the absolute coolest. She's absolutely rad. She now lives in Minnesota, and so she's just the absolute coolest. But so I read about her in a book, and then I had her. She's been on Equal Time, tons of times. I've met her. She's super cool. But she was your youth coach when you were back in Portland, right? When you were like 6, maybe, like super young.
I was super young. I actually met her because I was a huge University of Portland
Uh huh.
Pilots fan, who
Uh
she
huh.
played for,
Uh huh.
and she was like one of my favorite players. And then I didn't ever have her as a club coach, I don't think, but
Okay. Okay.
I did like some individual lessons with her and some teammates and stuff growing up. So have definitely known her for a really long time and got to reconnect to her this past year at Aurora.
Uh-huh. Yeah, she does. For those who don't know, she does like sponsorship and ticketing stuff for Aurora. So she's been around there. We're not quite able to use her on Equal Time the same way because she works for an actual club. Um, but yeah, shout out to Hugh for randomly sending me that book, which was really really good. And shout out to the dads, of course. We show the moms love all the time, because moms are easily the biggest supporters of Equal Time. It's not even close. But dads are second. So give a shout out to the dads for sure. Um, I do. I am curious too. We talked about all your individual skill and all your individual training, and your game, especially like your goals and your highlight plays, are such obvious, like standout, visible highlights that people see in a game. And so I think I might assume that a player like you would show pretty well in like a tryout environment, because I thought about this all summer with these Super League tryouts of players that I know are of a certain caliber but weren't getting signed. They would go to these tryouts and they wouldn't get signed, and I'm kind of like, but I know they're capable of being on a team like that. And I tried to remind myself of how weird tryouts are. Like, tryouts are so strange. The idea of being able to show in a tryout is so different than showing well in a game or showing well in 5 days of training. For you, do you feel like you excel in that environment, or is it, what were those situations like for you? Did you have a process for amping yourself up and preparing for it? It's a whole universe of its own. I don't know.
Yeah, it definitely is a super different environment. I did go to a few USL Super
Uh-huh.
League tryouts
Uh-huh.
that I didn't end up getting
Yeah.
offers or signed from. Um, yeah, it's definitely different because I feel like in a team environment, like you're playing with those people for a certain amount of time, you really get to know their
Mm-hmm.
tendencies and like how you mesh and want to play with each other. Whereas a
Yeah.
tryout, you're going in with no one really knows each other.
Yeah.
You're kind of just getting thrown together, which, yeah, I think is definitely a different environment.
Uh-huh.
I think how I personally try to prepare for those is like reminding myself, one, what the situation is
Uh-huh.
going into it, of like not necessarily altering how I'm playing and stuff, but
Uh-huh.
remembering like, okay, it's going to be completely new people. So
Yeah,
just
yeah.
adapting and like trying to learn tendencies and how to play with people as quick as possible.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, I would say I definitely felt a little bit disappointed not getting anything
Y-
after coming out of both of those tryouts.
Yeah, yeah.
I felt like they went
Uh-huh.
pretty well from a personal standpoint.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I guess that's how tryouts go. And I
Yeah.
think it also has been interesting of I feel like a lot of teams are looking for certain positions or certain player
Right.
profiles or something that maybe I didn't fit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would
You,
say that was kind of my
yeah.
takeaways from tryouts.
Well, you also have this funny thing of anyone who has any amount of like outdated thinking about what central midfielders could be also like sometimes hits you where like you're like 5'3" or whatever, 5'4", 5'3", and you know, you're not huge, you're not like Lindsey Horan size, or like, you know, you're not like Sam Mewis height or whatever. And so I think aren't I've at least heard, like, when I chat with people about you, that sometimes that's a hit on you, where like a coach will be like, well, I don't know if she's big enough to play in the midfield or blah blah blah, or they like think you're too small. And so somehow in a tryout environment, does that somehow like hit you because they see you in person and they see you're small or something? Like it, like the random people who might have an outdated idea of like quote unquote too small, do you feel like that has sometimes hit you?
I don't know. I didn't get a ton of specific
Uh-huh.
feedback afterwards as to like
Yeah,
why.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so I don't
yeah,
know.
uh-huh,
I have been really trying to work on the defensive side of my game and
yeah,
making that a strength, because I do know I'm on the smaller side where that's not
right,
necessarily something that's going to go in my favor in a lot of people's views.
yeah,
But yeah, I guess I've always tried to combat that by making
uh-huh,
it a strength and something that like you can't
yeah,
dispute. Obviously, something that I'm still working on,
yeah.
but yeah.
It's, well, it's funny because I don't like, I literally don't have any memory in my mind of you like getting shoved off a ball. You know, like I don't have like these, of all the games I've seen you play it with the Gophers, I've seen some Stanford stuff, a ton of your U20 stuff, all the Aurora stuff. Like I literally can't remember a time where I was like, "Oh yeah, they kind of bodied her off." You know, like so it's so funny because, you know, you super high work rate, you obviously like are a workout warrior, you're like fit as hell, you could go 90 whatever. And so it's funny, but you know, if you see you next to a giant midfielder, I guess someone who's just like using their basic monkey brain would be like, well, I'll take the bigger one. I don't know, it's just, it's so funny. I Because I do have memories of, you mentioned trying to like work your defensive side. There have been times where you literally play as a six, like with your time with the U20s. I think I'm remembering this right. There was a coaching change with the U20s during your time,
Hmm.
and I forget if Laura Harvey was the first or the second coach for you, but there was a coach that was playing you truly at the six.
Hmm.
And the only reason I remember it so much is because it was around the same time where the Gophers, during that spring COVID season, Meg Gray was playing as the holding midfielder, and there was like some random half where Steph got nervous and thought she like wasn't playing tight enough back there, and so she shifted you to six while you were with the Gophers. And I
Hmm.
remember being so frustrated by it because it felt like such a coaching move where it's like the trying to not lose versus trying to win. Like playing you at the six is a really safe thing in the sense that you're super smart, you have a great work rate, you can totally play the six, but like all of your brilliance with scoring then just like gets sucked into the, you know, gets sucked into the abyss or whatever. But when you've had to play like truly in that holding role, do you like doing that as much as you like attacking? Like my fan brain wants to see you in the final third, but for you as a player, are you just as satisfied if you have to get thrown at like, or if someone converts you to like fucking outside back or something? Like could you actually be as satisfied in a role like that? Or like to me, you're such a pure 10, but to you, do you think of yourself as something other than that?
It's a good question. I would say I feel very comfortable anywhere in the center.
Yeah.
I feel most natural in the eight, where I
Okay. Okay.
can kind of do a little bit of that attacking as well as defending.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think I've always felt very comfortable in any three of those roles, and I
Yeah.
think yeah, they do ask for different things.
Right.
So a lot of it is mentally preparing myself of, okay, as a six, my role, how do I use how do I use my strengths in this role? It's
Yeah.
not necessarily going forward and attacking as much. It's more so,
Mm-hmm.
okay, how do I position myself defensively to cut off passing lanes and
Right.
anticipate, and then how can I use my passing ability a little from a little bit of a deeper position. So I think there's really fun things about each of those three midfield roles that
Yeah.
are a little bit different from each other.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. It does make sense that you would identify as an eight because even when you play the 10, there's so many times, or who cares? Like if there's two attacking midfielders in front of a holder, like who cares who's the 10 and the 8, I guess. But even when I think of you playing the 10, you track back so much anyway that it feels like an 8 because you're always trying to like be a good teammate, be a good worker, shut off that passing lane and stuff. So it's like in your bones to track back anyway. So I guess you're always going to be doing that kind of tracking, probably just in your DNA either way, I guess.
I try to.
Well, and we're talking about sort of like 6, 8, and 10 as if everyone plays a 3-person center midfield or whatever.
Yeah.
But do you, like with DC, and you can, we don't have to give away all the secrets, but even like in your scrimmage with UNC, like what kind of shape are they playing in the midfield? Is it a 4-3-3 or is it a different midfield shape than that?
We have some different rotations that we do, but yeah, it starts as a 4-3-3.
Okay.
And when I was playing against UNC, I was mostly the 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, and even, I tell people all the time, sometimes people over focus on like formation and whatever, like is a 4-2-3-1 that much different than a 4-3-3? Like it really is about how you're playing it. Even in a 4-3-3, you could say two mids are supposed to hold more versus attack. So it's like, we probably over assume the formational stuff, but we have to have some way to talk about it, I guess.
Yes.
Pause super quick just to shout out our sponsors. You see them up on the screen. Pentz Homes. If you're looking for a house or trying to do a renovation, anything home based, go check out Nate and Lydia. They are the absolute best to work with. I'm sitting in a house they help me find. Even if you're in other states, even if you're in DC near Katie, even if you're a fan out there, they can actually refer you to a realtor there and find you a good trusted realtor. So check them out. Their trusted finance partner Angie Shear is the absolute best. They're super progressive, super nice people to work with. They can help you find anything you need. Also, shout out to Modist Brewing, which somehow has a head brewer from our tiny town of Walker, Minnesota. Shout out. You can get a nice summery super deluxe. Even I am not drinking at 9 in the morning in Minnesota, but had to shout out the can. Their brewery is right by Target Center, so if you want to check out a Lynx game, they're coming back from the Olympic break. Go check them out. Grab a beer at Modist beforehand. Head over there. They're the absolute best. And shout out to our Patreons too. You see the Patreon link down there. I'm flying out to LA to cover the Gophers at USC and UCLA. I drove to Madison for a St. Thomas exhibition. We're only doing this crazy stuff because you guys are giving us money to do so. So keep doing it. I remember, I think Katie, you personally asked me, I think you asked like, someone thought I did this at full time, and I've stopped laughing at that question, but it is very, very not true. And we would love to have more money to cover more things. I do have a whole day job that pays my mortgage. So the Patreon support is much, much appreciated. So Katie, I want to jump back to I've mentioned that Gopher spring season a few times. The part of that season I haven't mentioned yet is there was a very funny period of time where I knew you were transferring and it was not announced. And it's always been really funny to me, the things that sort of I can't really talk about publicly, but I know. And the transfer portal is maybe the funniest, only because literally every college soccer coach in the country knows players are in it. But players, it's so stressful to be in the portal that players don't want to be like telegraphing that they're in the portal. You also were in the portal while playing a season, which is really stressful. I just want to go back and talk to you about, I don't think we've ever had a real in-depth discussion about it, of what was that decision like for you? I know how stressful and how crazy it can be just to come to that decision point and then to actually live through that experience. For you, what do you remember about that, of the stress of having to decide that, and even what was going into like, okay, how do I make this decision that I know will be really tough, but I just, I want to take this risk?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the hardest decisions that I've had to make.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed my time at Minnesota and will always have a special place in my heart for all of the people that I met there. And I think that's one of the things that made it so hard, of like, okay, I love the coaches, I love my teammates here, but
Yeah.
there was a part of me that wondered what it would be like at a different program. And I think also wondered what it would be like at a smaller school. That was another part of it. that, yeah, I got to Minnesota and it felt like it was this huge school and I had the soccer team and stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of outside of that, especially with COVID and like
Mm-hmm.
literally taking all online classes and stuff, didn't really have
Yeah.
that community outside of it, which is something I think I was also really missing with
Mm-hmm.
my college experience. So it was a really hard decision to come to, but ultimately came to that decision. I think it was, I want to say over winter break
Yeah.
when I was at home, and then was
Uh-huh.
lucky enough that they ended up letting me come back and play that spring with them,
Uh-huh.
which I'm super grateful for because I feel like that gave me a lot of closure there. And I don't necessarily know that I would have felt that if
Right.
I hadn't had the chance to go back there.
Yeah.
So yeah, got to play spring season with them,
Uh-huh.
but I had made the decision of where I was going before that season just because I
Mm-hmm.
kind of didn't want to be thinking about that
Yeah.
while playing games and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, the transfer portal is a very interesting thing, and I feel like it has changed the dynamic a lot with
Uh-huh.
a lot more people making the decision to transfer and making it a little bit easier to
Mm-hmm.
do that, and for coaches as well to find players who are looking to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the school stuff or like the general non-soccer stuff, because anytime I've thought about that situation when you made that decision and the whole whatever, I've never thought about that part of it. You know, the idea of all the other stuff outside of soccer. Obviously, because I'm covering you as a soccer player, I go soccer first or whatever. And let alone the fact that it was happening during that COVID era too,
Yeah.
which I think people still probably underappreciate, especially for like college students that were expecting to have a certain experience and then it's so dramatically different is,
Hmm.
kind of wild. But even soccer wise, it's funny because I pretty much think what your decision soccer wise must have been is essentially like staying at Minnesota or going to Stanford or going to another school where you ended up at Stanford. It sort of to me feels like the trade-off you're making or like the bet you're making is either by staying at Minnesota you're like a star-ish player or a lead player on a team that's not quite as good. Like from my perspective, for those who didn't follow, 2019 was a really tough season.
Yeah.
It was technically the worst year in Gopher history.
Yeah.
It was a really tough fall season before COVID shut down. And it was a better bounce back in the spring, but just for folks who were not following the team at the time. And so to me, the trade off seemed like essentially okay, if I know I want to be a pro eventually, I have these big goals, I can either stay at this program where I'm getting a decent amount of attention and I'm even getting called into the youth national team. So, like, I'm getting a decent amount of attention, but I know I'm not going to be on, like, you know, a Final Four team or like a top 20 team or whatever, versus go to a very well established, very recognizable program, but risk having a smaller role on it or whatever. Like my brain assumes those are like kind of the soccer trades you were considering. But
Hmm.
to you, did it feel like that was the trade, or what was like soccer wise how you were processing the decision?
Yeah, it definitely did feel like that a little bit. I
Mm-hmm.
think it kind of came down to wanting to be in an environment where I feel like because I don't want to say I wasn't being challenged at
Yeah, yeah.
Minnesota, because I think I think there definitely were a lot of quality players there and
Yeah.
coaches who were pushing me and stuff. But I think going to Stanford or going to a different school where
Yeah.
there's other players who are aspiring to play pro, play for national teams and stuff, I think that is a different environment
Yeah.
than I was getting at Minnesota. And I think that's
Yeah.
something that I was aspiring or still
Mm-hmm.
am aspiring to do and wanted to be in that environment.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was definitely a big part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, kind of like you touched on, it was scary because it was like, okay, I'm having a lot of fun playing at
Yeah.
Minnesota and feel like I have a key role in,
Uh-huh.
um, yeah, feel
Right.
confident in this role and stuff. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
was definitely a challenge with transferring and something that I was kind of weighing as I was making the decision.
Uh-huh.
But I think ultimately I felt like I was going to regret it and have it in the back of my mind, kind of what
Yeah.
if I didn't make that jump.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny you talk about it that way, because there might be elements of the experience you ended up having at Stanford where you have like, so you might also have small elements of regret about transferring, but the thing is, you would have for sure also had regret about staying. So it's like the trade is
Yeah.
so tough. It's all like
Yeah.
margins and stuff. And I'm curious too, when you mention, like you mentioning the who you're around and their level of commitment, um that's so unbelievably real. Like you sort of spoke to it in a really nice way. It's I've so many players have talked to me about that. So many players, like
Yeah.
a player that leaves Minnesota because they weren't necessarily going to be able to start or whatever, and they go to a school like in the MAC or something.
Hmm.
And when I chat with them like a year later, I'm like, hey, how's it been going? Blah blah blah. They're like, yeah, I didn't really expect how different the commitment would be. Like
Yeah.
the idea of, like in her experience, she was going from a place where like being with the Gophers in the Big Ten was a certain level of commitment and
Yeah.
investment, and she went to one where it was lower. And
Yep.
all you're describing is that, yeah, and there's layers above. Like it's, all the programs you could be in just are on a spectrum of like the most insanely and maybe even over invested to not invested enough. And so each team is just going, it's just a fact that it's going to fall in that spectrum.
Yep.
And so it's like, I'm curious from your perspective, did part of your antenna for that level of commitment come from being able to play on those U20 teams where, oh, this is what it could be like? I'm with these players who are like me, who want, like, did that help give you perspective on like, oh, this is a level of commitment there could be?
That's a good question. And yeah, I think observing University of Minnesota and
Mm-hmm.
my time at Stanford,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if level of commitment or
Right,
like
right,
things we were doing were so much different. Like,
right.
honestly, the schedules, I would say, were actually somewhat
Yeah,
similar,
yeah, yeah. It's yeah.
in a lot of ways.
Both places are an absolute shitload of work.
Yes, for anyone thinking about playing D1 soccer, it definitely is was a big time commitment, at both schools in a very good way. But I would say it was more so, um, I would more so say individual players as
Yeah,
opposed to
yeah.
the way
Right.
the program was run. I think, yeah, being in those U20 environments though
Yeah,
was was eye opening, and also like, okay, there's another layer.
yeah,
And then I think also getting to go in with the thorns and stuff sometimes of,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay, like there is another layer of
Uh huh.
this soccer piece that, like, I think for me, being around players who are better than me in a certain area has always been super motivating, of
Yeah,
trying to learn from them and trying to learn what makes them successful. And I think
yeah.
it was cool to spend that time at Stanford and be around some of the top players
Uh
and
huh.
see, okay, this is what makes them great in terms of habits, or in terms of this is things that they do on the field that I want to try to add to my game.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the, like, one dynamic I've had a hard time trying to verbalize for people is like you playing with the Gophers at the time on, like, let's describe even just that spring season. So like a 500 like Big 10 team.
Hmm.
Like, so a solid Big 10 team. If someone watched you playing those games with the Gophers that spring, and then they watch you with the U20s, there's a strange dynamic I've tried to describe to people, and I'm not very good at verbalizing it, where you looked even more impressive when the level was higher. Like, which theoretically, like when it's harder and the opponents are better and it's more challenging, you were actually more impressive. Like, I thought you showed in those U20 settings so well. You were like the starting 10 in the CONCACAF U20 championships alongside all these players who are, legitimate World Cup quality players, and you were a peer and you looked so good. And if someone just watched a random Gopher game, I don't know. I mean, maybe people smarter than me would have thought this. I don't know if they would have watched it and been like, "Oh wow, she's capable of playing like at national team level." Like, I think very smart soccer people would, but like a dummy like me, you watch. And so the idea that your game scales even better when the talent around you is even better was like so obvious to me, seeing those really close together, of like you're playing in the U20s and then I see you with the Gophers, and I was like, well, I've seen it like with the U20s, like we've seen it. To you, do you feel like a different, like when you're, you know, playing in, like I guess you mentioned like training with Portland, and for those who don't know, I've posted it and it's like I think known, you trained with the Thorns every summer like for years, like forever. I think when Aurora was getting started, like very getting started before it existed, probably wasn't called Aurora yet, I probably messaged you. I think I messaged
Yes, I
you
think you. Yeah,
and I
yeah.
was like, hey, there's gonna be a new team, it's gonna be fun. And I was like messaging you, I'm like, we're gonna, you know, wouldn't it be cool, you'll get to get games, whatever. And it's so funny because I was pitching you on come playing in, for some summer league team, and it's like, bro, I literally trained with the Portland Thorns all summer. I mean, like, because you did, it was multiple years of doing that, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I think my summer going into my sophomore year might have been my first year doing it.
Yeah,
But yeah, definitely got a few summers with them, which has
yeah,
been really cool.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I remember. So when you got drafted by them, I was getting random questions about this all summer because people don't really get like the drafting and
Mhm.
contract and whatever process. And so people are like, whoa, how's she playing with Aurora? Is she on loan? Blah, blah, blah. Like, since you got drafted, they assumed that meant you had an automatic contract, blah, blah,
Mhm.
blah. But, and I can say it and you don't have to say it. You getting drafted by Portland and then being offered like a training spot or whatever, because you're a local Portland kid and legitimately really good and have trained with them. But it's also like the most NWSL thing of all time. Like NWSL teams know to draft local because it increases the chance that like maybe you'd be game to train because you can like live at home and save money and whatever. But it is also like the most NWSL thing of all time. It's like, you know, Red Stars are going to draft Northwestern players and Rutgers players are going to get drafted because it's, you know, it's just they know you. You've been training with them for years and years and years. But when you got drafted, did it feel different to be in that training camp environment, even though you'd been training with them forever and forever? Was there a different level of sort of like pressure in your mind of like, oh, but this is like, I have to like get out and earn a contract, not like I have to train well?
Yeah, I think there definitely was another layer of pressure. I
Uh huh.
think coming in as a training player,
Uh huh.
the mindset and the goal is, okay, how can I contribute most to
Yeah.
the team in this role of being a training player? I'm not trying to earn a contract, trying to earn time or
Mm hmm.
anything while in that role. So I definitely, yeah, I think being in that role these past few summers,
Uh huh.
I definitely do feel some of the pressure of, okay, I'm in a pro environment,
Yeah.
like need to lock in, need to
Uh huh.
hopefully not mess up their drills and stuff. But other than that, like
Yeah.
it's not a ton of pressure. I think there was that added pressure of,
Uh huh.
okay, there's a contract on the table and
Yeah.
it is like you're now competing for a spot, competing, trying to compete for time and stuff.
Yeah.
Which yeah, I think I was disappointed to not earn that
Uh
in
huh.
the end. Um, but yeah, I would say learned a lot from that experience in terms of being in that environment, one, but also two, being in the being getting the experience of competing for a contract.
Right.
I think even though it didn't turn out
Yeah.
this time, I am really grateful for that experience and like also feeling that pressure and stuff, because I think
Right.
I feel more prepared for that if I
Right.
were to get another opportunity, whether that's with
Right.
an NWSL team or a team abroad down the line.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think definitely a good learning experience.
Yeah. Having to go through, I mean, just having to go through it, it's like, yeah, it sucks you didn't get the contract, but it's like, well, what did I get from it? I got this experience and I, you know, what, yeah, it's worthwhile because like you said, you know, yeah, you could play with DC Power for like 10 years and it could be the best Super League team in the league and you could win championships and
Yeah.
make a shitload of money. Like, yeah, that could happen. Or, you know, athletes change teams, it happens. It's like not that many people play for a single team their whole year. So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, there'll be a time again probably where you have to do it. So it's, yeah, good to have the experience.
Yeah.
One thing I forgot to jump in and mention too when we were talking about the transfer process, I think is a little underappreciated, or at least your experience helps highlight it, is the role that assistant coaches play in these situations. And so the other detail I didn't mention is the reason I first knew you were transferring is because I was working on this big oral history feature about you. And at a certain point, I think I got like a cryptic note from when I was checking in with people about approving all their stuff. They were like, hey, you might not want to post this. And I was like, what? And so that's why I eventually learned early, because we never posted it because, well, I could just do that and add on to it, I guess. But so I was doing that story, and a big part of that story was your recruitment to the U at the time. Crystal Coleman-Seidel was the associate head coach, who's, you know, a longtime equal time favorite, was on a show a few months ago, is now coaching at Wright State. And so she was leading the recruitment of you at the time, which is somewhat common. Like assistants might lead on certain players, or maybe they lead on all the recruiting or blah, blah, blah. And then from what I've heard, you also, but then she left. By the time you got here, she had left to be the head coach at McAllister or whatever. So she's no longer on staff. And then sort of a similar thing then happened to you at Stanford, right? Where like a Stanford assistant was the one sort of recruiting you when you were in the transfer portal or leading it or whatever. And then that assistant left too, where it's like, man, twice in a row, this is like big time bait and switch vibes.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy how much turnover there is within college soccer coaching, especially, sorry, there's a big bee next to me. How much turnover there is, especially with assistant coaches.
Right.
Because as you touched on, Crystal was kind of the one, and I would say Coach Golan did a lot of my recruiting at the U as well. Right. But yeah, Crystal was a huge reason that I ended up committing to the U, and then she ended up leaving right before I got there. And then had Molly for my first season, who was like one of my all-time favorite coaches. She ended up getting a head coaching job, and then had Maya for my last year, who was also great. So I got super lucky in that, like, there was a lot of turnover, but like ended up having a really good connection with all of the assistant coaches that I had at my time there. But then same thing at Stanford, where Hideki, who is now the head coach at Utah, did literally all my recruiting for that. And then he left. And then Marg, who is my head coach or assistant coach there my first year, is now the head coach at UCLA. So it's just, I feel like it happens. I don't know if I just got unlucky with that, but I do feel like it does kind of happen everywhere, where there's just a lot of turnover, especially with, they're all super good coaches and deserve a head coaching job. So I'm not, I've been sad, but part of me also understands that, like, that's probably what they're working towards, and it's very well deserved.
It's just so wild. I had forgotten that you also hit that Molly year, because Molly's just Molly Rouse, who's now the head coach at Ole Miss, is just, you know, an absolute like badass. Is so cool. I randomly talked to another coach this week for some content that isn't out yet, and they brought up that they took their A license class with Molly Rouse, and we just like BS'd about how great she is for like 15 minutes. So Molly, we're sending positive vibes about you down to Mississippi. I'm curious too, during the Olympics, it's so fun. I can't watch the like Trinity Rodman, Germa, or even like when Fischel gets mentioned. I can't watch any of these players without thinking of that U20 team that you were on. I'm curious for you, what's it like in moments like this, where like literally in an hour or whatever, the national team's going to play, and players you literally have trained with, played games with, given assists to, you know, what is it like for you watching these games, knowing like, these are my teammates, and, you know, maybe like I can find my, you know, whatever. I don't know if you still like hold those goals of like, let's do it, baby, let's get to full national team, or do you just watch that and be like, oh, I'm so happy for them? Like, how do you process all those emotions of watching players you've literally played with and succeeded with? Like, you were, you know, you were the star 10 on that team, like I said. But how do you process that stuff of like, you can't watch the national team without seeing literal teammates you've had?
Yeah. I would say I more feel happiness and
Yeah.
almost pride for them also of
Yeah.
like seeing especially players like Naomi, who I got to play with
Uh-huh.
a little bit more during college, and
Uh-huh.
Sam, who I got to play with a little bit in Portland.
Uh-huh.
Like seeing those players that you get to train with and seeing them succeed on that big of a stage, I
Yeah.
think is really cool. And
Uh-huh.
also a little bit of like, oh, like that's like I feel really grateful that I got to play with them. And
Yeah.
like, yeah. I would say yeah. And it does feel like you almost have a little insight into the way they play sometimes
True.
too of
True.
like, okay, like I've seen her work on that a lot, or like
Yeah.
I've just seen her make that tackle so many times. So I think that part's really cool as well.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, even honestly, even for me, I feel like little morsels of that only because when I was so like bewildered that you weren't getting poached by a Super League team in the spring, I had to sort of remind myself of like, I'm ridiculously precisely built to know like the heights of your game compared to other people, because I watched all of those U20 games and I'd sort of
Yeah.
forgotten how many of those there were,
Yeah.
because you got called in multiple times and whatever. And so I really did see like every minute of your highs, like the highs of your
Yeah.
highs.
Yeah.
And but because I was watching all those games, like even when Trinity Rodman first started getting her early opportunities, and people were like, "Oh, who's this? Oh, this young player. Oh, her like her last name and her connections there, and oh, who's this person?" I'm like, I've watched like 10 games of this player. Like
Yeah.
I've watched this player already just
Yeah.
because she was the forward on that team, or
Yeah.
like Mia Official when the big news when she went to Liga MX and for years she
Yeah.
wasn't getting called into the national team. I'm like, yeah, dude, I've seen her shred. I saw her shred on the U20s.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, it's so funny. Well,
Yeah.
Katie, we were taking way too much of your time. The women's national team is playing in the Olympics. You have a team lunch. You got tons of stuff going on. Now with DC Power FC, folks really follow along. All the games are on Peacock. Equal Time will be following the Super League really close. We got Jenny Vetter out in Spokane. I believe Morgan Stone is still on trial down in Fort Lauderdale. So for all I know, she's been signed, or maybe she's still fighting. We got tons of fun Minnesota connections with that league, and just really excited for more opportunities for pro players in the U.S. Katie, I've babbled at you for way too long. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.